Nuclear weapons can seriously compete with the internet and antibiotics for the title of the main invention in human history. It is almost impossible to find scientists who deny that atomic bombs caused a sharp decrease in the number of global conflicts in the middle of the last century. Of course, there are many wars on the planet, but from the point of view of human history, nothing has changed. Unfortunately, there have always been wars and apparently there will always be wars. Nuclear weapons have only reduced the number of wars on a huge scale. After all, everyone understands that a battle with mutual destruction is pointless. But will it be mutual destruction? Isn't it a historical myth? Is nuclear winter real? We'll talk about this after learning more about nuclear weapons in the next couple of minutes. Our first stop, of course, will be Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Terrible and fortunately the only disasters involving the use of nuclear weapons. They are easiest to use as a reference example. An example that will instantly run into the first myth about atomic bombs. It lies in their supposedly insane lethality, which became the reason for the instant surrender of Japan. It's not like that at all. After all, Tokyo suffered almost the same destruction without nuclear weapons. On March 10, 1945, in just one day, 334 US B-29 bombers destroyed 40% of the city's housing stock. This is about the same amount as the atomic bomb destroyed in Nagasaki. And the situation is similar for victims. In just one day of bombing in Tokyo, according to the most conservative estimates, 80,000 people died. The reality is that from the perspective of World War II there was little difference between atomic weapons and classical bombing. On February 13 to 14, 1945, as a result of the Allied raid on Dresden, about 100,000 people died. And we don't even touch chemical weapons. It easily competes with nuclear weapons. In 1935 to 1936, Italian chemical attacks killed 275,000 Ethiopians. The number of victims of the bombing of Hiroshima-Nagasaki could not be compared not only with the main battles, but even with ordinary battles of the Second World War. In a couple of weeks of the Bialystok-Minsk battle, the USSR alone lost 341,000 people. And the loss from the atomic bombings is far from what forced Japan to surrender. They lost many more people from conventional bombings, and capitulated due to the USSR entering the war. This is precisely what Emperor Hirohito cited as the main reason in his statement on August 17, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not mentioned at all in the paper. But as for subsequent events, the fact that no one really knew how much the United States had and was not aware of the real scale of destruction played a role in the buildup and fear of atomic weapons. By the way, they are the second myth about atomic weapons. It lies in the fact that the bombing supposedly wipes out entire cities from the face of the earth, making the space uninhabitable. In reality, again, everything is not quite like that. In an air explosion with a megaton power, the zone of complete destruction is less than 4 kilometers. In the average, about 7, and at a distance of 10 kilometers only 5% of the population will die, and this is a classic modern bomb. Tens of times weaker ones were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The main damaging factor in Hiroshima was the fire, because the buildings were typical Japanese, made of wood and cardboard. Geographical location also played a role. After all, in the hilly Nagasaki the firestorm never arose. And most of the brick buildings continued to stand. In other words, atomic bombs are scary, but they don't turn huge cities into dust. We can say that this is not a problem, because since the times of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear potentials of countries have increased significantly. And humanity can throw packs of bombs at each other. This is also a myth, because nuclear weapons are incredibly expensive. You can often come across a statement that the bombing of Tokyo in World War II was the result of the work of thousands of people and ammunition. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki were defeated with just one bomb and it is much cheaper to fight with nuclear weapons. This is not at all true. After all, the budget of the Manhattan Project in 1945 was 90% of the total expenditure on small arms and almost 40% of the total expenditure on tanks. 2 bombs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki were worth tens of thousands of tanks and planes. But this is just a bomb that still needs to be delivered. The budget for the creation of the B-29 bomber is even larger than that of the atomic bomb. And in general it is considered the most expensive project of World War II. Let's say you say that it's easier to talk about development and further production. This is also a mistake, because producing an atomic bomb is incredibly expensive. And most importantly, does it need to be constantly maintained? For example, the United States is now modernizing W-80 nuclear warheads. And each will require $75 million. According to calculations from a book by nuclear expert Stephen Schwartz, from 1948 to 1998, the United States spent $5 trillion on its nuclear arsenal. For comparison, this is 25 of China's annual military budgets for 2021. In general, it's hard to call atomic weapons cheap. And the United States and other countries are reducing their nuclear capabilities not out of the goodness of their hearts. If atomic weapons were so cheap and simple, these potentials would only increase. We are not so naive as to believe in humanism and the destruction of nuclear arsenals for the sake of humanity, are we? If you are still in doubt, the next myth to dispel your opinion is the simplicity and safety of atomic weapons. Supposedly, without a fuse, they can play football and nothing will happen. This is partly true, but in life everything is much more complicated. And there are many incidents related to nuclear weapons in history. For example, an investigation by the DEN National Interest Portal showed that at least 1,200 U.S. nuclear weapons in the period from 1950 to 1968 caused dangerous incidents. And by this we mean no tea spilled on the warhead. In 1980, a worker in Arkansas dropped a wrench attachment into the silo of a Tatom-2 rocket. It pierced the rocket's first stage tank and caused a leak. The staff was quickly evacuated, but at 3 a.m. on September 19, a W-53 nuclear-tipped missile exploded. The 740-ton silo cover was torn off like a feather, and even though the warhead seemed to remain in order, the soul of the U.S. command did not become any easier. So the next time you scold yourself for your hands growing out of nowhere, remember the hard worker with the wrench. There was another no less dramatic plot. On January 24, 1961, a B-52 aircraft carried 2 thermonuclear bombs 260 times more powerful than those that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A fuel leak was discovered, which led to the destruction of the aircraft and the death of the crew members. The bombs were unhooked from the planes according to instructions, only the parachute opened on only one of the 2. And 3 out of 4 fuses turned off, putting the bomb on alert. Only the low-voltage switch saved the United States from a disaster of unprecedented proportions. Well, the second bomb was scattered so much that the engineering troops had to search for the plutonium and the warhead and a bunch of radioactive debris. Now remember that there have been more than 1,000 incidents like these in just 17 years. And the question of why countries are reducing nuclear weapons will resolve itself. This is thoughtlessly expensive, dangerous, and fraught with unrealistic consequences. We think we've sorted this out and will move on to other myths. For example, about irreversible radioactive contamination of the area. A small spoiler may be that now Hiroshima and Nagasaki are quite populated. Well, in more detail, the intensity of radiation 7 hours after the explosion of a nuclear bomb drops 10 times. After 49 hours it's 100, and after 343 hours it's 1,000 times. Between 45 and 70 years. Among Japanese bombing survivors, the rate of leukemia was twice the normal rate. This is scary, but still we are talking about no more than a percentage of the total. Moreover, within a year after the bombing of Hiroshima, 40,000 American soldiers controlled it. They did not yet know about radiation sickness and wore ordinary clothes. and yet no mass mortality was recorded. Once again, let us remind you once again about exclusively wooden cities, without specialized shelters. If they had been in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the loss figures would have been completely different. At Bikini Atoll, for example, the Americans tested a 15-megaton hydrogen bomb, and 4 years after the explosion, visiting biologists discovered something funny. Meter-tall corallas bloomed right in the explosion crater, and the underwater ecosystem was completely restored. In general, the transformation of the Earth into a nuclear desert, even with the explosion of all atomic bombs at the same time, should not be expected. Well, in short, the myth that a nuclear war will split the Earth was invented during the Cold War. In reality, a ground explosion of an incredibly powerful 58-megaton ammunition, similar to the Tsar bomb. It will create a funnel with a diameter of about 200 meters. There is even a very simple form that calculates the consequences of such explosions. To create an artificial Lake Chagin in 1965, they even dug a well 188 meters deep. And after the explosion, the crater still turned out to be about 100 meters deep. Splitting the globe and piercing the Earth's crust is definitely not an option, even hypothetically. This is something on the level of urban legends. The same can be said about the guaranteed tenfold destruction of life on Earth during the detonation of all nuclear weapons. The average power of current warheads is somewhere around half a megaton. But even if you take a 5-megaton bomb, calculate its lethal effect and divide it by the total surface of the Earth, you get about 70,000 such bombs. Humanity has no trace of so many bombs of this class. There are only about 13,000 of them, and even then, the vast majority are much weaker. Well, if people want to create such a number of warheads, they will run into the myth that we talked about earlier. This will require trillions of budgets, and the risks of accidents will be such that no one will do it. So, to summarize, we note that, unfortunately, or fortunately, nuclear weapons are still not as scary as they are considered by the masses. Newly declassified U.S. intelligence data states that according to their calculations, in a strange one, 50 warheads are enough to effectively maintain parity of forces and prevent a third world war. Will humanity succeed in this? Wait and see. Well, that's all we have for now. Until next time.